In this episode, a monster emerges from the collective fears of a society and threatens to destroy it until a leader steps forward to encourage them to reject their fear and embrace hope and unity. Hey, can we use that same trick to get rid of Trump? Oh, I made it political. This is a review of the Star Trek Deep Space Nine episode, The Storyteller. If you have not seen this episode and you don't want to know how the story ends, Storyteller? Anyway, be warned, spoilers beyond this point. Dr. Bashir and Chief O'Brien head to Bajor to respond to a vaguely described medical emergency, while Commander Sisko tries to resolve a dispute between some guy and a pissed-off teenager. In other words, Star Trek. Before leaving to see about that aforementioned medical emergency, which apparently threatens an entire village, O'Brien catches up to Sisko and asks if he can be excused from this mission on account of not wanting to spend several hours alone on a ship with Bashir. Sisko's like, no way, man, this is season 1 and Bashir's annoying as shit. I've been really looking forward to getting him out of here for a while. Looks like you drew the short straw this week. Now get your asses to Bajor. Bashir walks in like, ready to go, Chief? This is gonna be so much fun. I can't wait for us to be best friends. Yeah, me either. While O'Brien and Bashir head off to Bajor, Sisko and Kira prepare for these mediation sessions. The dispute is between two groups who occupy adjacent territories on Bajor, the Paku and the Navat. There's a treaty between them that defines this river as the border between their territories, but what happened was, during the occupation, the Cardassians diverted the river, moving it 20 kilometers west into Navat territory. If the treaty is interpreted literally, with the river still considered the border, then that means the Paku's territory is now that much bigger. That doesn't work for the Navat. Kira warns Sisko that both sides of this negotiation are likely to be incredibly stubborn, a situation which is complicated even more when they meet the leader of the Paku and she turns out to be a teenage girl. Her name is Varys, and she's a lot. Sisko calls an informal getting-to-know-each-other meeting before the official negotiations begin, and Varys throws a drink in Quark's face for calling her a little lady. Understandable, Quark's trademark homespun Southern charm isn't for everyone. Meanwhile, after a long runabout flight during which O'Brien mostly avoids having to speak to Bashir, the two of them arrive at the Bajoran village. Everything seems strangely fine for a place that's supposedly facing an existential crisis. Then, this guy Farron runs up to them and leads them to the room of this old guy, the Syrah, and explains that if he dies, the entire village dies. Unfortunately for the village, Bashir doesn't see that there's very much he can do for the poor guy. There's nothing wrong with him. He's just old and his time has come. The Syrah's not going to let something like imminent death stop him, however. He wakes up from a little pre-dirt nap and starts babbling something about the Dal Rock to his assistant, Hovath. He looks to Bashir like, are you the one sent by the prophets? No, not you. Bring me the other one. The one with the big head. Bashir's like, Chief, he's asking for you. O'Brien comes over and clasps the old guy's hand like, hi, big admirer of your work. I think RoboCop 2 is criminally underrated, and I happen to know our station's chief of security is a fan of Eyes of Laura Mars. The Syrah's like, my man, we're gonna be okay. Meanwhile, back at Deep Space Nine, negotiations between the Paku and the Navat are going poorly, but Nog and Jake have spotted Varys, and they are instantly smitten. They work up the nerve to introduce themselves to her and invite her on a tour of the station. Back on Bajor, it's nighttime, and that means showtime for the Syrah. He's dragged his old ass out of bed and gotten dressed, and, against Bashir's protests, the Syrah climbs up to a spot overlooking the village. The rest of the villagers gather around underneath. Some very spooky-looking storm clouds assemble in the sky overhead, and the Syrah starts yelling about the Dal Rock, how it is approaching now, full of hatred and rage toward the village. The wind begins to blow, and one particularly spooky-looking cloud seems to be approaching the village. O'Brien tells Bashir that he's not picking anything up on his tricorder. Whatever's there doesn't seem to actually be there. As the Syrah continues talking, encouraging the villagers, telling them that they are stronger than the Dal Rock, a beam of light begins to stream from the village toward the cloud, and the cloud is pushed back. But then the Syrah collapses, and the scary cloud makes a comeback and attacks the village with lightning. The Syrah yells for his successor, and his assistant, Hovath, steps up, But the Sirrah's like, "Not you, you loser! I want that sweaty Irishman!" The Sirrah pulls O'Brien up there with him. O'Brien's like, "I think you got the wrong guy." But the Sirrah says, "Shut the fuck up and say what I tell you to say." And O'Brien repeats what the Sirrah tells him to say, more reassurance that the village is stronger than the Dalrock, and encouragement to unify and drive the Dalrock away, and hey, look at that, the beam of light is back. The scary cloud gets smaller and smaller and goes away. Yay, we win! Nice job, O'Brien. Oh, look, the Sirrah's dead. No problem, though. Farron declares that the village has a new Sirrah, Chief O'Brien. Everybody's happy. Back on the station, Sisko calls Varys in for a private meeting to ask why she's being such an obstinate little shit in these negotiations. Sisko says that he believes people can find solutions to their common problems if they work together. But if Varys doesn't believe that, if she's not here to talk and try to reach an agreement with the Navat, then she might as well leave, because she's wasting everyone's time. Varys goes to pout on the promenade, where she runs into Jake and Nog again. They bond over their dads. Jake's is awesome, Nog's is a dimwit, and Varys's is dead, killed by the Cardassians. Then Odo runs them off, and the three of them go to get in some trouble together. On Bajor, O'Brien is trying to figure out what the hell he's going to do, because apparently the Dalrock cloud monster is scheduled to come back one more time tonight, and without the Sirrah to help him, O'Brien has no idea how to fight it off. O'Brien's lack of confidence has not rubbed off on the villagers, however. They all seem thrilled with their new Sirrah. And speaking of rubbing off, Farron shows up with some concubines. O'Brien's like, "Oh, no thank you, not interested." "Oh, of course, sorry, you're into dudes. Let's get some fuckboys in here for the Sirrah." "No, I'm married. And my wife and I are monogamous, as far as I know." "Of course, Sirrah, we will respect your strange ways." Hold up, does this mean that the old Sirrah was getting laid 3-on-1 like they just offered to O'Brien? No wonder he hung on to the job until death itself yanked it away from him. Horny old bastard. With negotiations between the Paku and the Navat still at a standstill, Varys gets another visit from Nog and Jake. At first, she doesn't want to hang out, she's got a lot on her mind, but then Nog quotes a Ferengi rule of acquisition about how instinct combined with opportunity leads to profit, and Varys changes her mind and goes with Jake and Nog to do something fun, like break into Odo's office. Nog says, "Let's steal Odo's bucket," and he runs into the back, returning a moment later with Odo's bucket as promised. As he approaches Jake and Varys, Nog trips and spills something from the bucket all over Jake. Nog's like, "It's Odo! I microwaved him! This is what dead shapeshifters look like!" But it turns out to only be oatmeal that Nog filled the bucket with, using the replicator. What a funny joke. Good times. Oh shit, here's Odo. He's probably not going to think this is too funny. O'Brien is sweeping the village with his tricorder looking for some clue as to what the Dalrock is and how to defeat it when a woman approaches with her baby. O'Brien's like, "Now you're offering me your children? What kind of sick people are you?" Bashir's like, "No, I think she just wants you to bless the child." O'Brien's like, "Oh, okay, bless you, child. I'm sure you'll grow up to be a good person, whatever the hell that means around here." The happy mother leaves as a crowd of admirers approaches, and Hovath, the old Sirrah's assistant, looks on and seethes. O'Brien retreats to the Sirrah's private chambers, and Hovath follows him in, pulls a knife, and tries to kill him. Bashir walks in on the attack, and together, after a struggle, O'Brien and Bashir are barely able to overpower and disarm Hovath. Shit, that dude must work out. Hovath accuses O'Brien of not being the true Sirrah, and O'Brien's like, "No shit." Hovath explains that he was the Sirrah's apprentice. But a few days ago, when he got his first chance to lead the villagers against the Dalrock, to tell the story, as they say, he blew it. And several people were injured because Hovath was unable to control the Dalrock. The secret, he tells O'Brien and Bashir, is in the bracelet the Sirrah holds. The stone is a fragment from an orb of the prophets, and it actually creates the Dalrock, which is a manifestation of the villagers' fears, and then allows the villagers to send it away by creating the beams of light. The villagers don't know that, though. They think the Dalrock is real. Why do any of this in the first place? Because the village used to be extremely divided and filled with hate and mistrust. The first Sirrah created the Dalrock and the tradition of telling the story to defeat the Dalrock to bring the village together. And it worked. And if they can send the Dalrock away one more time, Tonight, it won't come back for another whole year. But since the villagers rejected Hovath and are still insisting O'Brien act as the Sirah, the odds aren't looking so good. O'Brien puts on the Sirah robes and climbs up to that spot overlooking the village, and he's like, "Okay, who's ready to defeat a Dal'Rok, huh? Let's do this!" So, you know how there's this Dal'Rok, right? And it's a scary cloud man who hates the village for its permissive attitudes towards sex, but the village can think at it real hard and zap it with magic lights. So let's all do that now, shall we? Let's make with the zappy zaps, people. Come on! Surprisingly, O'Brien proves to be a total flop as the Sirah. The wind is picking up, lightning is flashing. Hovath and Bashir are standing in the crowd, and Bashir says, "Hey, do you think maybe the Sirah did all of this on purpose? After you shat the bed your first time up, he chose O'Brien as his successor, knowing he wouldn't be up for it, and you'd have to bail him out. This is your big chance to step up and win the trust of the villagers as the one true Sirah. Are you listening to me? I'm explaining the plot." The Dal'Rok zaps O'Brien, and Hovath rushes up and grabs the magic bracelet. He takes over the story. This time, he doesn't blow it. He rallies the villagers to beam the light back at the Dal'Rok and send it away. The villagers are like, "Hovath is the Sirah!" and they rush toward him to celebrate. O'Brien turns to Bashir like, "Let's get the fuck out of here." Back on the station, after another talk with Sisko, Varys has decided to offer a compromise to the Navat. Move the border back to the original path of the river, but also open up free trade between the Paku and the Navat, which will benefit both sides. And somehow this is thanks to hanging out with Jake and Nog, but apparently mostly Nog, because when Varys sees Nog, she kisses him on the cheek and ices Jake out completely. Hang in there, Jake. Your day will come. Bashir and O'Brien arrive home, and Bashir's like, "That adventure we just had on Bajor is going to make a great story to tell around the station." And O'Brien's like, "You tell it. I've had my fill of storytelling for a while." Ha ha ha! The end. In the last one of these reviews I did about the TNG episode The Nth Degree, I talked about how in many ways that episode is representative of TNG as a series. Along those same lines, I think this episode, The Storyteller, is representative of the series Deep Space Nine was when it began. In fact, it might just be the perfect example of a typical early episode of Deep Space Nine if it weren't for the fact that it's not very good. The Storyteller is not a difficult episode to watch. It's likable, it's easy to sit through, but it consists of two parallel plots, both of which feel extremely thin and extremely basic, and both of which are hobbled by some clunky, amateurish writing. The A story, the one from which the episode takes its title about O'Brien and Bashir in the Bajoran village, starts out promisingly enough. Two Starfleet characters beam down to a place where there's a weird thing happening. The guy in charge of leading the people through the weird thing dies and chooses one of the Starfleet characters as his successor, which is a problem since the Starfleet character has no clue what they're supposed to do. It's a classic Star Trek plot. I can easily imagine Kirk and Spock, or two randomly chosen members of the TNG crew, finding themselves involved in a situation exactly like this on their respective series. In hindsight, we know the pairing of O'Brien and Bashir works because they eventually become best friends, but this is the first time we get an O'Brien and Bashir episode, so their chemistry has yet to be established at this point. But it turns out to be an inspired team-up right from the start. As the show goes on, O'Brien and Bashir will grow to like each other and adopt more of a squabbling buddies dynamic. But here at the beginning, their vibe is much more overtly antagonistic, and it works splendidly, with O'Brien as the forever downtrodden everyman and Bashir as the brash, excessively talkative young guy who just wants to be friends with his new coworkers. They bounce off of each other throughout this episode in very funny and entertaining ways. So, if there's a solid premise and the plot is anchored by two characters and actors who work well together, why doesn't this work? Because I don't think it does, unfortunately. One problem might be that the ending is such a foregone conclusion. Hovath, the old Sirah's apprentice, is literally hovering around for the entire episode as O'Brien fumbles his way through being the new Sirah, and it doesn't take a genius to guess how this is all going to work out. But for me, that's not the big problem. I usually don't mind a foregone conclusion as long as it's well executed. This one isn't. For one thing, we spend almost no time with Hovath. His animosity toward O'Brien after the old Syrah dies is obvious, but is mostly kept on the margins until he attacks O'Brien with a knife. After the attack, Hovath immediately calms down and becomes an exposition dispenser. There's very little tension between him and O'Brien because he and O'Brien aren't in scenes together. Plus, Hovath's character arc from failing at his first attempt to take over as Syrah to succeeding in his second attempt when he rescues O'Brien falls flat because we don't actually see that first attempt. We hear about it from Hovath, and pretty late in the episode, too, like right before O'Brien goes out to confront the Dal'Rok and Hovath has to bail him out. That's not much time to get invested in a character. It's also not much time to get the point across as to why the Syrah chose O'Brien and snubbed his apprentice like he did. The writers of the episode apparently realized this, but too late to do a more thorough rewrite, which is why they just crammed a bunch of dialogue into Bashir's mouth where he straight up tells Hovath what the plot is. Bashir turns to Hovath and says, "You know the Syrah orchestrated this scenario with O'Brien so you could be a hero and prove yourself to be worthy as his successor, right?" They could have at least written it so Bashir leads Hovath up to that revelation, but allows Hovath to make the final leap himself. Instead, Bashir spells it out for him. And for us. Deep Space Nine in general is a show that respects the intelligence of its audience, but that's not the case here. The broth is even thinner over in the B story, the riveting tale of Varys, Princess of the Paku, and her kinda sorta adolescent flirtation with Nog and Jake. This feels like the creators were reaching for an excuse to showcase Jake and Nog, which I'm totally fine with, came up with the idea of the two of them having a crush on Varys and chasing her around, then the writers let it get away from them and it wound up feeling like it was supposed to be about Varys all along. Which, again, is fine in theory. In practice, however, Varys can barely be considered a character, and the performance by Gina Phillips can barely be considered acting. That's too harsh. I'm not trying to run down Gina Phillips. She's young here. According to IMDb, this is only her fourth credit and her first job on something other than a sitcom. And Varys is a tricky part, made more challenging by how underwritten she is. But even after making all those allowances, Phillips doesn't do a very good job here. She's supposed to be playing a character who is out of her depth and projecting false confidence to compensate, but she comes across as an actor who is in the same situation and doing the same thing. Given how important her character is to this plot, it's a hard thing to get past. The problem with Varys and with her story is that we never see her beyond the surface level. She comes in as a stubborn, short-tempered kid who is determined not to get pushed around by the adults in the room who underestimate her. As with so much else in this episode, that's a fine place to start, but we never get any indication that there's anything more to her than that. Even the attempt to shade her in a bit by giving her a tragic backstory and parents who were murdered by the Cardassians feels superficial. Her escapades with Jake and Nog are supposed to help her realize that she needs to be willing to compromise with the Navat instead of just planting her feet and refusing to budge to prove how strong she is. But I don't see how any of her interactions with Jake and Nog get her to that place. Jake and Nog are both interested in her because she's a pretty girl, and though Varys doesn't seem remotely interested in either of them in that way, she seems to enjoy hanging out with them because she doesn't usually get to spend much time with people her own age. Okay, again, fine, but what does that have to do with her deciding to compromise, to settle the dispute with the Navat? There's a scene where she explains the situation to Nog and Jake in general terms. There are people who have something I want and I refuse to give it to them. And then Nog says, "Is there anything they have that you want?" And Varys reacts as though this has never occurred to her before. And then they break into Odo's office and get caught, and then Varys meets with Sisko and tells him that actually she was really hanging out with Jake and Nog in order to learn about Sisko. And when she saw how much Jake looks up to him and trusts him, it reminded her of her own father, who was strong and feared by the Navat. That's why she doesn't want to compromise. But then, at the end of the scene, she decides to compromise, which she does by offering to redraw the border with the Navat in exchange for free trade, which is something that is never brought up once in the entire episode until Varys mentions it to Sisko in literally the final scene. It's just a lot of stuff that is presented as though it all ties together when it doesn't. Varys starts out one way and ends up another way, and a bunch of stuff happens in between, but there's no change or growth or sense of causal connection between the stuff that happens and the supposed result. Deep Space Nine, as most of you know, is my favorite Star Trek series, and I am somewhat in the minority in believing that it was a good show from the very beginning. There's a conventional wisdom in the fandom that says it doesn't actually get good until season 3, but I reject that completely. It gets good in season 1. Its pilot episode is one of the best in the franchise, and that first season includes some genuinely great episodes that can stand alongside the best offerings from the show's rightly celebrated middle and later years. There are also some clunkers, like the Storyteller, though this one is far from the worst show they did in season 1. But even in an underwhelming episode like this one, you can see the elements that make Deep Space Nine a great show, and that set it apart from the other Star Trek shows that came before it and after it. For example, early on, when Nog and Jake are loitering on the promenade, Jake tries to talk Nog into going into the holosuite and playing some baseball, and he mentions Buck Buckeye. This is the first time we've heard that name. 2 weeks later, an alien impersonates Buck Buckeye in the episode If Wishes Were Horses, and that feels like a payoff to those of us who were regular viewers of the show, because we know who Buck Buckeye is. We heard Jake mention him and call him the greatest hitter of all time in this episode. Is that a little thing? Sure. But from the beginning, Deep Space Nine was threaded through with little things like that. Throwaway lines establishing something that was going to come back in a future episode. Situations or conflicts or character traits that would recur across multiple episodes or multiple seasons. Deep Space Nine was no less episodic than TNG was or Voyager would be, but its writers took the time to build connective tissue between the episodes that allowed them each to stand on their own while also feeling like they were part of a unified whole, and that was happening from the very beginning. This is also a Bajor episode, which I like. Again, I'm probably in the minority here. One of the reasons why so many Trekkies mark Season 3 as the point at which Deep Space Nine becomes a good show is because that's when they introduce the Defiant, and the premise of the show starts to broaden beyond just Bajor and the wormhole, and the series shifts a bit more in the direction of a conventional Star Trek show. And hey, I love the Defiant. I love the look of it on the outside. I love the set design on the inside. I love how cramped and close-quartered it is. Of all the ships we see during the TNG era of Star Trek, it feels the most like an actual spacecraft or military vessel instead of a flying luxury hotel. But I also love the hyper-focus on Bajor in the first 2 seasons. I'm intrigued by the concept of Sisko and the Starfleet crew being sent here to help this wounded planet recover and prepare to join the Federation, which was originally a major component of the show's premise. I'm also intrigued by the possibility of what a weird and wacky place Bajor is. On Classic Trek or TNG, this village with an imaginary fear monster would have been located on a random planet that the ship visited once and forgot about. But on Deep Space Nine, this village and its imaginary fear monster is on the planet right next to the space station. I just love the idea of doing bizarro Planet of the Week plots, but it's always the same planet, and it feels like if the show had remained on its original course, we would have gotten that from Bajor. And I mean, we still see some Bajor set weirdness here and there, even after they get the Defiant and Worf shows up and the focus of the show shifts to the conflict with the Dominion. But I wish there were more episodes where members of the gang from DS9 find themselves drawn to some out-of-the-way corner of the planet where something utterly nuts is happening. That concept running parallel with the "we're getting this planet ready to join the Federation" premise just really, really appeals to me. The Storyteller was directed by David Livingston, who directed 17 episodes of Deep Space Nine, at least one in each of the show's 7 seasons, including my favorite Star Trek episode ever, The Visitor, and it was written by Kurt Michael Bensmiller and Ira Stephen Bear, from a story by Bensmiller, which he originally pitched for TNG way back in season 1 of that show, which was only like 6 years before this episode was made, so not that far back, I guess. I like Jake and Nog. I like O'Brien and Bashir. I like Weird Bajor. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the concept of a monster powered by our fears that can only be defeated when enough of us find the courage to stand up to it in solidarity feels all too relevant as my country continues to sprint downhill into fascism. But for all that it has going for it, the episode ultimately fails due to some obvious, superficial, ham-handed writing. In the end, the problem with the Storyteller is the storytelling. Those are my thoughts on the Storyteller. What do you think of this episode? Please share your thoughts with me in the comments. If you'd like to support this channel, and I sure wish you would if you can afford it, you can do so by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Steve Shives, becoming a channel member by clicking the join button, or by making a one-time gift by clicking the thanks button, or via PayPal or Venmo. Links are in the description. Please join me next time as this grab bag batch of reviews continues. Next up, a review of a randomly selected episode of Star Trek Voyager. That episode is from Voyager's 5th season, and it's called 1159. Make sure you're on time for that one. Thanks for watching, and take care, everybody.